Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Gary Schmidt. I'm a resident scholar here and director of the program on American citizenship. Also, I'll be moderating today's event, which is, title of the event is The Muslim American Muddle. Our format's going to be pretty straightforward. Speaking first will be Peter Scarry from Boston College, whose article, The Muslim American Muddle, was published this past fall in the journal National Affairs. Peter is also a fellow with the Keenan Institute at Duke and a fellow at Brookings Institution. Peter will speak for about 15-20 minutes, and then after Peter finishes, we'll turn to our panel. I think you all have full biographies, so I won't go through those, but the panel will comment on Peter's article and, of course, the issues he raises more generally. First up will be Andy McCarthy, who's a senior fellow at the National Review Institute, prolific writer, embarrassingly so, compared to the rest of us, and a former assistant U.S. attorney. Next up will be Hillel Fradkin, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and editor of the journal Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. Then we will hear from Justin Weiss, Director of Research for the Center of the U.S. and Europe at Brookings, and the co-author of the book Integrating Islam, Political and Religious Challenges in Contemporary France. And batting cleanup will be Suhail Ghanouchi, who is a university professor, a scholar of Islam, former activist, and a leader within the Muslim American community. Each of our panelists will have about 8 to 10 minutes to respond to Peter's article and the issues he raises. And after that, I will moderate the discussion between the panelists, and also obviously want to take questions from the floor. We will be wrapping up at 3 p.m., so we should have plenty of time for good back and forth, both between the panel and also with your help from you. With that, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you all for joining us today. And I want to thank my fellow panelists for participating in this event. I think we have a breadth of perspectives here that one doesn't ordinarily bring together to bear on these questions, so I'm grateful for that. And I definitely want to thank Cheryl Miller and Gary and the AEI Citizenship Program for not only sponsoring this event, but sponsoring other events that we've been involved that have led up to this that have been extremely helpful and stimulating. Well, let me just dive into my remarks. This is drawn from a dense article from the National Affairs, and I'll try to highlight the salient points. And begin by just pointing out that, as I say, a decade after 9/11, America has reached a political and intellectual stalemate regarding the Muslims in its midst. Many Americans continue to fear their Muslim neighbors and fellow citizens. Stoking these fears are zealous investigative reporters who cycle a body of facts about the Islamist origins and goals of most Muslim leaders and virtually all major American Muslim organizations. Largely taken from the federal government's successful prosecution of the Holy Land Foundation, which is a Hamas front group, this evidence is virtually incontrovertible, in my opinion, yet its implications are far from clear. On the one hand, these facts are frozen in time, artifacts of kind of political archaeology, as I call it, that are never put into any wider social or historical context. What the critics fail to acknowledge is that individuals who once worked with the Muslim Brotherhood or its various U.S. fronts do not necessarily remain committed to an Islamist agenda. People mature beyond youthful folly and rage, and America does cause immigrants to change. On the other hand, our political media and intellectual elites routinely dismiss these findings as irrelevant ancient history. This too is a mistake, both substantively and politically. Though these leaders and organizations do not represent all or even most Muslim Americans, they do dominate the relevant political space. Moreover, their Islamist ideology has had and continues to have a formative influence on how Muslims think of their place in America. Elite opinion also systematically denies or ignores that Islam is a dynamic, even aggressively proselytizing the religion. Muslim American leaders concede that not long ago they dreamt of the, quote, crescent flag flying one day over the White House. For many, this fantasy long since collided with reality, but for others, its influence lingers. Not unlike Catholics a generation or two ago, many Muslims today regard their religion as superior to all others. The failure of our elites to acknowledge such evidence has fueled the anxieties of Americans. But if elites have been too cavalier about the challenges Islam poses to America, ordinary citizens and their tribunes have been too alarmist, depicting a scenario in which Muslim leaders are not only devious, which many have been, but also omniscient, as if they were exempt from the difficult trade-offs all political actors inevitably face. In reality, Muslim leaders have invariably been recent arrivals, largely ignorant of this huge dynamic society and its complicated politics. And like other immigrants forced to learn and adapt, they have made mistakes, and lots of them. Remarkably absent from both the elite and popular scenarios is any appreciation of how America has changed Muslims, or any recognition of the irony that America might have changed or subverted those who have been out to change or subvert us. Such a reckoning would not only abate our credulity about the competence of Islamists, it would also help restore our faith in the resilience of American values and institutions, a faith that has been strikingly absent among Islam's most strident critics. And most important, it would facilitate our addressing the genuine challenges posed to America by Islam. And among those, the most salient is the political loyalty of Muslim Americans. This is not to suggest that Muslims are actively disloyal, yet their loyalty is muddled and confused, due in part to the influence of cosmopolitan values and policies such as dual citizenship. But the Muslim American muddle about loyalty also reflects the enduring influence of Islamist leaders, institutions, and ideology. Such influence is hardly unprecedented in our history as a nation of immigrants, but in our debates about America's Muslims, it has been overlooked both by complacent elites and alarmist populists. Before I proceed, some basic facts about American Muslims are in order. Though I have met few Muslims who fail to claim that there are 6 to 10 million of their brothers and sisters here, the most authoritative estimates indicate there are between 2 and 3 million Muslims in the U.S., less than 1% of our total population, a much smaller proportion than in any of the nations of Western Europe. And unlike Muslims in Europe, those here are generally well-educated and affluent, though there are pockets of poverty among some groups like Somalis and Yemenis. Generally speaking, Muslim Americans have education and income levels roughly comparable to those of the broader population. Frequently remarked upon but little appreciated is the enormous diversity of this small but growing population. America is home to the most diverse aggregation of Muslims on the planet. The overwhelming majority are Sunni, but Shia represent nearly a tenth. An alternative current is evident among Sufis, who are reviled by Sunni fundamentalists. Among Sunnis, disagreements flow from the various interpretive legal traditions. There are even strong divisions between Orthodox Sunni and various sects, such as the Ahmadiyya, the Druze, and the Alawites. Then there are racial and ethnic differences. Most visible and important is that between immigrant origin and African American Muslims. Less stark, but nevertheless important, are ethnic, national origin, and linguistic differences. The Pew Research Center identifies at least 77 source countries for Muslims residing in the United States. The most dominant divide is between Arabic speakers from the Middle East and Urdu, Pashtun, and Hindi speakers from South Asia. But even more, of course, Arabs have divergent histories and contemporary political realities. As the Arab Spring should remind us, when it comes to U.S. policy, individuals tend to organize not as Muslim Americans, but as Libyan Americans, Syrian Americans, and so forth. And the same is true of Afghans and Pakistanis. And of course, Palestinians have their own unique and tragic experience. Another overlooked fault line involves the salience of Muslims here as a religion. The vast majority of Muslims in America do not attend mosque regularly. Many simply regard religion as a private matter that does not belong in the public sphere. Then there are many immigrants of Muslim origin who have rejected their faith completely. Such individuals are likely to identify themselves simply in terms of their national origins. Taken together, all these differences make it highly problematic to speak of a single Muslim American community. Indeed, the overriding challenge of overcoming fragmentation and forging a Muslim American political identity explains a good deal about the behavior of both the leaders and their organizations, certainly as much as the influence of overseas Muslims or of Islamist ideology. That's what I'm arguing, at least. The other thread visible in any demographic portrait of Muslim Americans is the extent of their social and cultural assimilation. Once again, hard data are not available, but there's a good deal of anecdotal and fragmentary evidence underscoring how much Muslim immigrants have adapted to life in America. Yet one reason this trend has not received much attention may be the embarrassment of Muslims at where they started the whole process. Like many other immigrants, Muslims who arrived here as students in the 1960s assumed they would eventually return home. But unlike other immigrants, these newcomers were profoundly alienated from American culture and society. They feared that the salvation of their souls was threatened by their very presence here. In a 1986 article in a glossy periodical sent to thousands of Muslim households by the Islamic Society of North America, Imam Muzammil Siddiqui, longtime member of the Fiqh Council of North America, invoked the classic distinction between Darul Islam, where Islamic law prevails, and Darul Kufr, where it does not, citing the teaching that a Muslim may reside in the latter to perform a specified task, but, quote, must return to Darul Islam as soon as the task is finished, unquote. Siddiqui left no doubt that America is Darul Kufr and that we are in real danger, as he put it, of assimilation to a non-Islamic culture. But then, surprisingly, Siddiqui concluded that, quote, we do not suggest that Muslims should leave America or go back home whence they came, unquote. He went on to reassure his readers that his proposed course of action, quote, will not deprive you, we will not deprive you or ask you to be deprived of your jobs or your professions. So what did this leading Islamist jurist then propose? Well, Siddiqui counseled withdrawal from modern secular society. He specifically urged Muslims in America to establish and support mosques, to build Islamic schools and colleges, to read Islamic books and magazines, and to ensure an Islamic system of marriage for Muslim youth, as he put it. So was this a viable strategy? Siddiqui proposed a bargain that other immigrants have managed to pull off, at least for a generation or so, but the stakes are different and higher for Muslims. Indeed, Siddiqui and other Islamists have left their people in a real dilemma. You have chosen to live in a corrupt and ungodly society where the fabric of daily life is completely at odds with how Allah has taught you to live. But it's okay to pursue your careers in medicine and engineering and send your children to American universities, as long as you stick close to your mosques and schools and make sure your daughter marries a good Muslim. No wonder many Muslims have shunned this advice. If Muslim immigrants have not assimilated to mainstream American values, many of their children have, just as Siddiqui feared. Yet many Muslims did manage to maintain their faith and pursue careers in education while remaining aloof from the mainstream of American life. Both things happened. Fueled in part by continuing immigration and some conversions, mosques and Islamic schools grew in size and number. The few Muslim forays into the wider society, particularly in politics, were largely defensive in nature. Many Muslims, probably most, continued to believe at this time that it was haram or forbidden to vote in America. Those interested in politics tended to focus on developments back home, where many still plan to return. So during the 90s, which is the period I'm talking about now, there were complaints that mosques were ethnic country clubs or Islamic fortresses, and that Islamic schools were too isolating. So as countless Muslims have recounted to me, it took the events of 9/11 to finally, as they put it, force us out of our cocoons. Since 9/11, over the past decade, leaders have seriously endeavored to get ordinary Muslims to engage with American society and politics. Yet there are still strong countercurrents pulling them away from anything not Islamic. Today, at meetings nominally devoted to politics and civic affairs, attendees can be heard changing the subject and asking leaders if it is permissible to befriend non-Muslims or to attend business luncheons where alcohol is being served. Such questions do not necessarily come only from recent immigrants. I recall a memorable session at the 2004 annual conference of an organization called the Islamic Circle of North America, one of the major Islamist organizations. Imam Siddiqui was there, and he found himself before a room full of agitated young men preoccupied with the upcoming presidential election. As they put it, "We want to support John Kerry," they implored the imam, "but how can we do so and remain good Muslims when Kerry and the Democrats support rights for homosexuals?" Siddiqui's response was as direct as it was startling in light of his previous writings. "Look," he said, "no one is forcing you to be a homosexual. Let them have homosexuality. If you think Kerry and the Democrats are the best candidates, then vote for them." I cannot prove that Siddiqui meant what he said that day. No matter. My point is simply that Siddiqui and his Islamist colleagues are now pushing back against the same conservatism they once worked to instill. I have no illusions that his fundamental views have changed, but I do believe that he has been desperately trying to extricate Muslims from the bind he helped lead them into. Similarly unresolved is the matter of Muslim loyalty to the United States. A visitor to the large conventions to which Muslim American organizations attract thousands of attendees is struck by the complete absence of any acknowledged tie to this country. No one pledges allegiance to the flag, and there are no flags on display. Attending one of these conventions over a 4th of July weekend, one hears not a word about the significance of that date in American history. Convention goers are routinely urged to organize and vote against the Patriot Act and to claim their civil rights, but they are almost never urged to consider their obligations as citizens. This lack of any overt display of loyalty may be due in part to the disdain expressed so often by non-Muslim elites toward patriotism and indeed the nation state, and with the elimination of the draft and reliance on a professional military, the signals sent to earlier immigrant groups about the importance of military service as a way to demonstrate commitment is clearly far weaker than it used to be. Yet the absence of acknowledged ties to America also reflects Islamist ideology that has nurtured these organizations. For example, their leaders have never explicitly renounced the caliphate, a failure that engenders considerable confusion among many young Muslim Americans. Similarly, the routine invocation of the Ummah, or the worldwide community of Muslims that transcends all the barriers of ethnicity, race, and nationality that I mentioned before, that fosters ambivalence as well and reinforces already pervasive incentives to avoid military service or to oppose any use of American force in Muslim countries. Now, this kind of posture, it seems to me, is not easy to explain. Deception and dissembling should not be ruled out, but these do not provide a satisfactory explanation across large numbers of individuals. Many Muslims, even many leaders, are likely acting out of habit or filial piety. Even for those who are not Islamists, figures such as Sayyid Qutb or Hussein al-Banna are considered part of their heritage. Among the more initiated, these figures are revered as martyrs. Overarching all these factors is the sheer opportunism of these leaders, which typifies Islamists wherever they have been closely examined. Finally, these leaders have become mired in the day-to-day demands of running organizations that have become dependent on sponsoring large conventions that generate the visibility and financing to keep things going to the next convention. As one insider complains, we don't have leaders, we have managers, we have conference speakers. As another former leader puts it, his colleagues, quote, refuse to deal with their baggage, unquote. Switching metaphors, he adds that instead of subjecting their Islamist ideology to serious scrutiny, these leaders simply park it, or alternatively, they put it on a shelf where they can see it and proudly point it out to others, but do not necessarily use it, yet neither do they forget about it. So if Islamist ideology is important, but not as all important as its many critics believe, what else explains the political behavior of Muslim Americans, especially their leaders and organizations? Briefly, I would point to the domestic political dynamics here in the United States. I referred earlier to the small numbers and fragmentation of Muslims here. One result is that their leaders are preoccupied with mobilizing as many of their brothers and sisters as possible, including those who may have ceased to think of themselves as Muslims at all. Similarly, leaders constantly seek to overcome the many divides that fragment this potential community. These strategic concerns go a long way, it seems to me, toward explaining the great reluctance of Muslim leaders, even those who have escaped the confines of Islamism, to criticize one another, much less condemn extremists in their midst. For any such pronouncements would inevitably provoke divisive controversy and contention. Conversely, any such criticism of extremists by Muslims almost invariably comes from marginal Islamic sects whose leaders have no pretense or real hope of leading the large mass of Sunni or even Shia Muslims. In this post-9/11 era, the most salient and powerful means of mobilizing and unifying Muslims in America has been to focus on the undeniable, if invariably exaggerated, infringements on their civil rights. Leading this charge with great success has been the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE, which has not only thereby managed to transcend its origins as an American front for Hamas, but set the standard for advocacy for virtually all other Muslim organizations. So, the implications of my abbreviated analysis here, it seems to me, are substantial. On the one hand, our elites must overcome their squeamishness about questioning Muslim American leaders and organizations about their history and about the compatibility of their Islamist ideology with American values and principles. This means, however, that non-Muslims must pose such questions in reasonable and constructive ways. We must move beyond the inquisitorial stance of critics engaged in mere political archaeology. The repeated unearthing of the same damning facts over and over only encourages Muslim leaders, guided by the strident advocacy of groups like CARE, to mobilize and unify their numbers by wrapping themselves in evasive rights talk. The fundamental challenge here is not disloyalty among Muslim Americans, but their reluctance to confront the implications of the Islamism that has been part of their milieu and that their leaders continue to invoke, however ritualistically or unreflectively. Thus, our primary goal should be to exert, as I put it, constructive pressure on Muslim Americans, leaders and ordinary citizens alike, to deal with their baggage, as the saying has it. An exemplary step in this direction is the FBI's policy shift away from contact and cooperation with CARE. So was the Bush Justice Department's prosecution of the Holy Land Foundation, a Texas-based fundraising front for Hamas with ties to many Muslim American organizations. Today, however, the Obama administration is pursuing a more accommodating policy toward these organizations. This is regrettable, but in truth, there is only so much the government can or should do on this front. The most appropriate and effective sources of constructive pressure should be non-governmental actors, especially universities, think tanks, and the media. If any such substantive engagement with Muslims is to be undertaken, then non-Muslims will need to be much better informed. We must overcome the populist paranoia fueled by the evasiveness of our elites that demeans a free people. And rather than obsess over the presumed influence of overseas ideologies or governments on Muslims in America, we need to be cognizant of how American Muslims have adapted to some of the most dysfunctional aspects of our own politics. At the outset, I suggested that this kind of challenge is not unprecedented in our history as a nation of immigrants. One of the lessons to be learned from that history is that ordinarily, questions of loyalty have been worked out over time as immigrants and their offspring assimilate and adapt to American society. But these are not ordinary times, and the perceived threats are immediate. We do not have the luxury of time to allow Muslims to sort out their loyalty to America. We and they must face that challenge now. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Peter. Andy, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I really think there are a few more important issues than what we're here to talk about. And I want to salute Peter because I think he's done a real service in in offering up what I think is as comprehensive a look at how Islamic life is lived in America as anything I think that that you'll find certainly in popular literature, in my estimation, anywhere. I'm not on all fours with him, particularly on the matter of ideology, but I think it's crucially important that he's underscored what I think is the most important divide in terms of trying to understand this community, and it's a divide that I've seen going on, I guess, 20 years now since I got involved in prosecuting terrorists in the early 1990s, and that is the divide that exists between the Islamic leadership in the United States, that's the leadership of the mosques and the Islamic community centers, and the rank and file Muslim people in America who, in my experience, tend to be pro-American, pro-Western, and patriotic. We always remember even from the prosecutions that I've talked about, the hellacious stories of the terrorists and the absolutely dastardly things that they managed to carry out. What's often forgotten is the fact that were it not for patriotic Muslims, patriotic American Muslims in many cases, we would not have been able to infiltrate the terrorist organizations. We would not have been able to thwart them from terrorist attacks that they plan to carry out. We would not have been able to whip evidence into shape so it could make a compelling narrative for the jury. We have Muslim Americans who serve in our military, who serve in our intelligence services, without whom we would not have the tools that we need to arm ourselves against the Islamist elements, which are much more extensive, I think, than we'd like to think. But we would not have what we need to arm ourselves in order to protect ourselves. So I think that's part of it's a real part of the divide, and it's important to bear that in mind. I think that Peter is certainly logically correct that lots of people grow and mature out of their fervid ideological pasts. But I don't think we ought to overstate that. If that was something that was done with regularity among the Islamist leadership in the United States, there'd be no reason to be concerned about the dominance they have in our political space. So while I think that's it's a logically true proposition, I'm not sure that it carries over empirically with what we've seen. There's a principle in the law that addresses this. Juries are always told in conspiracy cases that if a defendant claims that he's withdrawn from the conspiracy, once you've proved that somebody's involved in a conspiracy, it's kind of on the defendant to show that he's done something unambiguous to show that he's pulled out of the conspiratorial activity. I'm not saying that the law of conspiracy necessarily squares up perfectly with how we ought to judge the Islamic community in America, but with respect at least to the leadership of these Islamist groups, I think it's a worthy principle to keep in mind. And just think about it. The Holy Land Foundation which Peter mentioned, yes, it's certainly possible that by repeating the same stories again and again, you can miss dynamism and growth in a community. But let's also not kid ourselves about what happened there, right? The most notorious piece of evidence that came out of that case was a 1991 memorandum about the Muslim Brotherhood and how it perceived its activities in the United States, which was basically to destroy the West from within by sabotage. That's what they said in their own words. Now, if that was just a piece of ancient history and we were repeating it again and again, maybe that would be problematic. But how did that come up in the case? It came up for purposes of proving a conspiracy to finance Hamas that went on for years and years after 1991 and was only stopped because the FBI put a stop to it. I do see the danger that Peter talks about in that regard, but I also think that we ought to reflect on the fact that the evidence that we saw in the Holy Land Foundation I think describes something that's dynamic and that continues to this day. To me, the most important part of Peter's essay is this business about how few American Muslims the Islamist organizations in the United States actually speak for. There was a study that was done in 2011 called Mapping Sharia, which got some attention. I don't think it got nearly the attention it should have gotten, but it was a peer-reviewed study. It was, I thought it was well done. It indicated that in 4 out of 5 mosques in the United States, jihadist literature is on offer. And in the mosques where the literature is distributed, it is recommended by the imams in the mosques. And those mosques also tend to feature guest speakers who have a past of virulent anti-Americanism and in some instances also pro-jihadism. So I think if it were true, if that's our picture of what the mosques look like, if it were true that the mosques were an accurate reflection of the Muslim community in the United States, I think we would have a major, major problem on our hands. And I think one of the things that's important that you can conclude from what Peter's done here is that that's not the case. What we learn, and what I think Peter captures well, is that most American Muslims don't go to the mosque. They don't go there with regularity. Even fewer American mosques see the Islamist groups that we have come to know so well as representative of them. And even the people who do tend to go to the mosque don't necessarily go there for ideological reasons. Some of them go both to the mosques and the Islamic centers and some of the conventions more for social reasons than ideological reasons. So I think that, again, this shows a real divide between what we see in the leadership and what we see in the rank and file. Of course, some of the people who do go for ideological reasons, and that's why I don't think that ideology is something that can be understated. And my biggest quarrel, if you can call it that, with the essay is just that I think it understates the ideological component. I don't think you can say, as Peter does, that Islam is an orthopractic religion and then sort of move on. And I don't want to be overly simplistic. I'm not saying that that's entirely what's done here, but I do think that there's a lot of focus on what Muslims do versus what Islam says. And I may be, as I said to Peter before we began here today, I may be hypersensitive to that because I've actually been involved in a debate in the circles of people who are ordinarily, well, a number of us have certainly been labeled Islamophobes and the like for trying to stress the importance of Islamic doctrine as the basis for Islamist ideology, and to stress the importance of trying to understand that, because I don't see how we can defend the country without understanding it. But I've actually been in a debate with people on my side for using the term Islamist, which they actually object to. I think it's important to have a term to divide the Muslims in the United States and the Muslims elsewhere, but particularly in the United States, who embrace the West and want to live in a society where there's a separation of the spiritual realm from the secular rules of civil society. The other side of this debate says that, much like Prime Minister Erdogan of Turkey says, Islam is Islam, and that's it. And that using the term Islamist is actually a cop-out. I don't see that, and I also don't think it helps us to try to reach out to the Muslims, of whom there are millions, who are our natural allies in the fight for survival against the elements that want to destroy us. I don't really see the the practical utility of telling them that their religion is incorrigible, and, now come join us and fight side by side. I just don't see that that's a winning strategy. But we can't underestimate the power of ideology. When I prosecuted the Blind Sheikh and the people who carried out the World Trade Center attack in the mid-'90s, during the defense case, we had any number of absolutely authentic, moderate Muslims come in to testify during the defense case. And there's no question they were completely moderate people. They were what I guess you would call Americanized Muslims. They didn't. They looked like They looked like any other New Yorker as they came in to testify. But they also. I'm sorry. I should say they came in to give testimony that wasn't necessarily in what you might call the Islamic context, but every now and then a question would arise about some matter of Muslim doctrine. What does jihad mean? What is Sharia? And the like. And on at least 3 different occasions, they would answer questions like this by saying, I wouldn't be competent to answer that. You'd have to talk to that guy. And when they pointed, they would point to the homicidal maniac in the corner of my courtroom. And I thought it was a pretty powerful lesson that you had these people who were absolutely, completely, authentically moderate people, but who, with respect to major matters of their own religion, at least doctrinal matters, would defer to somebody who was an out-and-out notorious terrorist. So yes, it's true that there's a good argument to be made that Islam is what Muslims do in America more than it is necessarily what the doctrine says. But I don't think we can underestimate either the importance of what the doctrine says or the influence of the major Islamist leaders who interpret the doctrine for rank-and-file Muslims.
Thank you. Well,
first, I also want to thank Gary and his colleagues for hosting this event. And it seems to me especially appropriate to host it given the character of Peter's article, under the rubric of a program on American citizenship. And I'll maybe make a comment about that. But the usual place these discussions take place is not under that rubric. It's more in the context of terrorist issues or international security or perhaps sort of Muslim issues more generally, but not within the context of the issue of American citizenship. And for reasons that Peter has already partially described, that's where it belongs. And I'll say a word or two about that. The first comment I want to make about Peter's article is this notion of the muddle. I think, in fact, Peter refers to 2 muddles. One is the muddle of Muslim Americans, and the other is the muddle of non-Muslim Americans. It's obviously necessary to say a bit about both, and I will. But in my opinion, the more important of the 2 is the Muslim American muddle, since the other one is derivative from it. The non-Muslim muddle is relevant by Peter's lights, as he partially expressed at the end of his remarks, insofar as larger American society is obliged to understand and take the measure of the Muslim community in its midst towards a decent outcome for both. I think it was obvious from the article, but also from what Peter said today, that both muddles revolve around the issue of Islamism, which often, of course, goes by other names, political Islam or radical Islam. And I think perhaps just for the record, it should be said something about what the definition of this might be. And here I'll offer just a general, if crude one, that Islamism is a modern radical Muslim movement of reform. And again, generally, if crudely, it is these days conventionally known under two forms: the Muslim Brotherhood and related organizations, to which Peter does refer in the article, like the South Asian ones, which are brother or sister organizations, and then violent jihadi groups best known through Al-Qaeda. And it seems to me the issue at the core of this article is how important Islamism is or may be for the American Muslim community, and what are its consequences. For obvious reasons, the jihadi or terrorist side of this movement is not unimportant. Nevertheless, the focus in Peter's article is on the Brotherhood, and I think for several good reasons. First is the fact that the Brotherhood aims to be, unlike Al-Qaeda or similar organizations, to be a mass movement of Muslim society. And second, the fact that almost all American Muslim organizations owe their founding to the Muslim Brotherhood or Muslim Brothers. So how important is the Brotherhood, and what are its consequences? And Peter's answer, which I would say offers both bad news and good news. The bad news is that almost all major Muslim American organizations are Islamist in origin. The good news is that it is doubtful that many American Muslims regard them as representative, and mostly go about their business trying to build their lives socially and economically. But as Peter remarks, and I think this was, in a way, was particularly reinforced by what Andy McCarthy just said, this is only partially good news. For, as Peter observes, Muslim Americans require, like all Americans, an understanding of how and why America can be their home, and how and why they can and ought to be citizens, and especially loyal citizens. And this, to date, by his account, and I think it's a fair account, is totally lacking. This, too, is the result of the influence of Brotherhood Islamism, both earlier and more recently. As Peter describes it, early on, the Brotherhood's essential ideological view provided no grounds for American Muslims to consider themselves as citizens. More recently, they have provided confusing grounds. Of course, this would not be such a problem if there were alternative sources of guidance to which American Muslims could look. But these are, for the most part, non-existent, in part because the Brotherhood claims prescriptive authority, along the lines that Andy McCarthy was just saying before, and is to some degree accorded that authority. Hence the muddle, a muddle which has serious consequences, since it is about, and I think here not the issue of terrorism, but about citizenship and loyalty as such. Can this problem be redressed? Certainly that's possible, but it will be a tall order, I think, for a variety of reasons. Some have to do not only with Islamism, but Islam. That is, up till now, traditional Islam has not provided much in the way of an explanation of why it is legitimate for Muslims to live as a minority in non-Muslim countries, still less how they can be citizens. Indeed, the whole issue of citizenship is a somewhat obscure matter in traditional Islamic thought. Other reasons have to do with the continuing ties of American Muslims with the countries of their origin. And at least in the short term, this dynamic may be enhanced by the Arab revolts, for the simple reason that, as everyone can see from the events of the past year, Islamism is on a roll and enjoying enhanced prestige, not necessarily here in the United States, but in a region terribly important to many American Muslims, either because it's their place of origin or because it's a place they look to as somehow the birthplace of Islam. And I think, and this is very early days in this matter, one cannot rule out the possibility that this will have an impact on the American Muslim community. This might be for the good, because what's going to be at issue is already an issue in the Arab revolts and their present aftermath, is what is the relationship between the religion of Islam and democratic political practice? That is, this long debated issue, which was in a way largely treated theoretically, is now going to be dealt with in a very concrete fashion. And if that has a positive outcome, then it's likely that that will have some impact, maybe considerable impact, on the way in which American Muslims think about the United States. But of course, it could just as easily be for the bad. It all depends, or not all depends, it depends partially on what the new Islamist politics looks like, and secondarily, what more general bearing it might have for American Muslims. And I think this is actually something really to watch pretty closely over the next not only months, but years. Now, Peter observes that American religious groups have faced such tall orders, and actually other groups, he mentions German Americans as well in the past, and cites the analogy of American Catholics. And I would say there is something to this analogy. Certainly I won't gainsay the opinion of Peter, who speaks with greater authority on Catholic experience. But part of what it shows, it seems to me, and I'm prepared to be corrected on this matter, on the American Catholic experience, is that tall orders often require exceptional men and women. And in the case of American Catholics, people who eventually formulated an understanding of why Catholics could be American citizens and why they could be loyal American citizens. One person often cited is John Courtney Murray. I know there are disputes among certainly more traditional Catholics as to whether that solution he proffered was sufficiently Catholic, but nonetheless it seems to have had a large impact. And that, I think, was important for the experience of the American Catholic community. For the moment, there is no sign of such people among American Muslims. That is, even if Islamism, and here I think Andy's point is very powerful, even if Islamism isn't accepted by lots of people in any formal way, there's no one offering an alternative that has any real substance. If I have a couple more minutes, 1 minute, I will say something about the second model, that is the existing non-Muslim model on this question, which Peter describes as a political and intellectual stalemate. The reason by his telling is that the framework of discussion is defined by two opposite, if equally extreme and faulty views. One which he attributes to, I think, zealous journalists, says that the Brotherhood or Islamism is everywhere and promoting Muslim American radicalism. The other, common among intellectual and political elites, says that the impact of Islamism is trivial to non-existent. I may add that in recent years, and this was alluded to by Andy McCarthy, this view sometimes included the notion that Islamism as such didn't exist and was a term invented by non-Muslims to attack Islam as such. As some, including myself, argued this was simply false and nonsense. The term derived from Muslims themselves, including the people it was said to describe. One might hope that the events of the past year, the Arab revolts, have put paid to this bit of foolishness, because the victory to date of the Islamist parties, and especially ones based in the Brotherhood, has made it practically impossible to speak of Muslim events without using this term. It's used now ubiquitously in the press day after day. But finally, Peter's point about the two poles, are they equally pernicious? The alleged risk with one is the incitement of Islamophobia, or perhaps more positively, that one does not provide constructive criticism or pressure. Frankly, I see very little evidence that Islamophobia has become a serious phenomenon for all the talk about it. And I read the CARE bulletin on the subject every day. All it seems to me to prove is what we all know, that there are nasty people in every society. You know, you can tote up in a society as big as ours, you can find lots of people doing, a fairly large number of people doing nasty things. Again, I believe it's the case that year in, year out, there are more, the FBI enumerates more anti-Semitic incidents or anti-Jewish incidents by a very wide margin than anti-Muslim ones. Does this mean that America is in the grip of anti-Semitism? No, it means that there's still some people who hate Jews. and there are some people who hate Muslims. That's the way it's going to be. I would say until the days of the Messiah, and my Muslim colleagues would say until the day of judgment, in which case we will all find out. On the other hand, I believe elite opinion has had an effect. Apart from other things, we can see that in the fact that our government has made the term Islamist impermissible, and it's beginning to make it impossible actually to, in a way, as Andy said, to defend Islam. And I think it's actually led, on the other side, contrary to the Islamophobic fear, to real harm. There are several, more than a dozen Americans dead as a result of this, lack of willingness to speak about Islamism, who happened to have been at Fort Hood one day when a certain person went wild over his notion of Islamist belief and killed 13 or 14 people. I don't remember anymore. So that could have been, frankly, prevented if people were being square. So there may be a muddle, but the question is what's the proportional contribution of the two sides? Thanks.
I'll probably pick up from where you finished, which is Fort Hood. I'll come to that in a second. But first, I'd like to join my thanks to Peter and Gary for including me in the discussion. I learned a lot with the article. I liked it a lot, including the elements of field research and interviews that Peter did. And even though I'm not knowledgeable on American Muslims as such, I've been following the debate, and of course I also find many parallels with Muslims in Europe. So I really was very interested by the article from for its descriptive aspects. On the prescriptive aspects, however, I must confess that I had a sense of disconnect between what I regard as the real security dangers linked with some forms of violent Islamism in this country, Fort Hood being one example, on the one hand, and the target or the center of gravity of Peter's article on the other hand. And I'll start with where you left, Peter, when you presented the article, which is also the end of the written piece. Today's threats are more immediate. We do not have the luxury of time to allow Muslims to sort out their loyalty to America. We and they must face the challenge now. So I asked myself, what exactly is that urgent challenge? And so I kept going upstream in the article and tried to find what exactly was the problem, the issue. The fundamental problem, you write, is not disloyalty among Muslim Americans, but the fact that Muslim organizations have basically not dealt with their baggage, that is, their Islamist origins. So Peter suggests that mainstream American institutions refrain from, I quote, routinely and uncritically engage with Muslim leaders and organizations that have not confronted their pasts. But if you take this as the sort of, once again, center of gravity of the article, I have 5 points or 5 objections to that take. The first one is, how salient is the problem today? And we talked a bit about this. We mentioned a piece from 1991. We mentioned the 1993 bombing. Perhaps these still have some effect, but it was 20 years ago. And so many people we're talking about were not born in 1991, 1993. Peter mentions the fact that the denial of the origins might contribute to the fact that educated young Muslims, and I quote, refuse to acknowledge that their organizations and leaders bear any responsibility for the suspicions that other Americans continue to harbor toward them. But, once again, that doesn't strike me as an urgent challenge or taken differently as a potential game changer if we are to address the stalemate that you mentioned in the very beginning of the piece. The second point is that, obviously we're talking about a new generation, and I'm more interested, and I would have liked to read more in the article about what they are thinking now rather than what the founders of CARE might have been thinking 20 years ago. This is especially true in light of the changes that you described, I think, very well inside CARE, which it seems, I mean, according to your article, make Islamism more distant and Americanism more pervasive. Indeed, Peter blames the CARE for being too American in their advocacy style, right? You criticize the hyperbole that pervades advocacy politics in contemporary America. So in a sense, they've become too American, and that's an interesting insight. The third point is, what is the remedy? So how do you operationalize the constructive the constructive criticism that you talk about, and where does it stop? I would say that's not entirely clear to me. I mean, are we talking about, do we need like a book by CARE, clarifying the origins? Is it a kind of loyalty test? Do they need to have a sort of, a bumper sticker? I'm no longer an Islamist now. Ask me how. At some point, I guess you have to take their declarations at face value. It's sort of the same debate as when do you stop apologizing? When there's a big historical massacre or something. At one point, do you stop apologizing? There's one. There's a tricky question of limits here. Until when are we going to focus on the origins rather than what people are saying now? Or if they are still saying things that are offensive now, then that should be the focus of our attention. The fourth point is that I'll go probably even further. I think Peter's article offers a good reason to take sort of a benign view of the question of the Islamist origins of these organizations at least two moments. When he mentions the process when he mentions that the process of integration takes time. Ordinarily, he writes, questions of loyalty have been worked out over time as immigrants and their offspring assimilate and adapt to American society. So them being muddled and confused, and I quote here again, seems to me, if you take a step back and look in sort of historical perspective, not that puzzling. And also when he stresses how unrepresentative these organizations are, and this has been mentioned by Andy and Hillel, so I won't get back into that, but should we really worry about organizations that very few Muslims actually belong to, and that 12% of them at most don't belong to, but regard as representing their interests on a population that, as was pointed out, is not very mobilized and does not even attend mosque in general. The last point, the fifth point, which is certainly not the least of them, it's actually by far my most important point, is, what is the most urgent and mortal danger of today? It has not come to my knowledge that any of these organizations that you refer to in the article were ever linked to a terrorist or a would-be terrorist inside the US. The real problem of today is Fort Hood, right? That's the problem we have on our hands. It's instant jihad or homegrown terrorism. And the reason is pretty clear. It's that not only such a link between a instant jihadist and one of these organizations would be a disaster for them, but one could argue that by standing up against Islamophobia, these organizations actually contribute to deflating the threat, to changing the environment in which that is conducive to instant jihad. So my recommendation would actually be the opposite of that of Peter, which is to engage them as much as possible to counter the real threat, which is that of the instant jihad. And that's one of the focus that we've had with Jonathan Lawrence in our work on Europe, his work on Europe and our work on France, which is how do states engage with these Muslim organizations, some of them being what Nicolas Sarkozy called spiced Islam, in a way to avoid the sort of offensive terms or a different qualification. So what has created homegrown terrorism or instant jihad, I think, is not CARE, is not ICNA or MAS. It's a combination of the Al-Qaeda narrative and the internet. And I would add, for the aborted cases, for the logistical breakthrough of these would-be terrorists, the FBI. see for example, there was this piece by John Schindler, I think 2 days ago, 3 days ago, in the website of the National Interest, and he was pointing to the last two instant jihadis, Sami Osmachak, who was arrested on January 7, is an Albanian from Kosovo, who lived in the Tampa area, and had the traditional trajectory of self-radicalization, and obviously it didn't have anything to do with CARE or any of the other organization. Or Craig Baxam, who returned to the United States last week from Kenya after a failed effort to join the Al-Shabaab organization, the Islamist in Somalia, and of course the others we know well, Major Hassan for the Fort Hood shooting, and many others. So bottom line, and I'll stop here, I must say that the reason why I was mentioning a sense of disconnect in the article is that I fear much more imaginary communities than Muslim associations, however distasteful their origins might be.
All right, thank you all. Gary, Peter, AI, distinguished panelists, and respected audience, for this opportunity for learning and exchanging ideas about this sensitive and pressing issues that get an increasing number of stakeholders who are more and more involved and concerned, including government, think tanks, civic organizations, and average citizens. And for those of us who care about both sides of the divide, the nation and the Muslim American community, the issue has even a greater importance. And tackling it is not really an academic or intellectual exercise. It's serious work that needs to be done to get this community in shape and on the right track. Well, I don't have the intellectual capacity of these guys, nor the command of English they had, so they give me like extra couple minutes. So that's, yeah. All right. I'd like to invite. I'd like to invite all of us and all stakeholders to handle this issue in a way that is fair, objective, and driven and guided only by the best interest of the nation. Whatever good for the broader community, as Peter calls it, will be good for the Muslim American, will be good for all parts of it. The opposite is not always true. Now, the Muslim American community is part of the American fabric. These people are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. So it is in the best interest of the nation and of everybody to get this community understood, shaped up, and fully integrated. That's what I believe. And this is essentially the responsibility of the community. So we should take the responsibility for that, and the burden is on us and on the leaders of this community. But it could be facilitated by the broader community in Peter's term. And if that's the case, if we are really driven and guided by the best interest of the nation, then the question, if we want to get this community there, fully integrated, shaped up, understood, then the question becomes how to do that. And that will lead us to the need for an assessment and diagnosis of the current situation, which Peter attempted to do in his essay. Now, as someone who is an insider in this community and someone who knows Peter very well, and we had discussed these issues frequently, there isn't new information that I found in the article. There isn't much that I didn't know before, but the ideas and the analysis were thought provocative and very interesting, and I can mention some of them quickly. Some of the key points that Peter raised: the stalemate that is the result of misunderstanding, and simplistic or wholesale approach by elite and populist or average citizen alike. The isolation and alienation of the community, fear and apprehension in the society, communities struggling with extraordinary diversity and fragmentation, identity crisis. I prefer identity than loyalty crisis. It is truly an identity crisis. If you scrutinized carefully. There is an image problem in this community. There is a leadership void and leadership crisis. There is an institutional disarray with non-representative organizations spinning their wheels and struggling just to survive and manage the status quo. Most of them are dysfunctional. Leaders and institutions delivering conflicting and confusing messages, providing no rallying cause or vision or sense of direction. Community in denial, focus on rights versus duties, on victimization versus responsibility. And the article concludes by that the issue is not disloyalty, but it's a reluctance to confront reality. It's, by paraphrasing, it's not only baggage, it's reluctance to confront reality. And conclude by saying that society needs to be much better informed about this community. The fact that the Muslim American community is in crisis and poses a serious challenge to the society is a given. I don't think anybody can dispute that. And the crisis is more severe and more compounded than the article suggests. And because there is so much you can do in an article, it can't be as comprehensive and as deep as it needs. But the prospect and the potential of this community are better than the article suggests. These are my opinion. I'm personally writing a book. It's going to come out very soon. I dedicated the bulk of it to diagnosis and assessment of this crisis, its root causes, and the solutions. Suggest some solution to it. So we're talking about a community that had a more problematic and slower integration process than normal, which created a severe and serious identity crisis. And all of that was unnecessary. It was not inevitable. It was not because of Islam. It was the result of inappropriate, deficient, and even mutilated Islamic construct, an understanding of Islam that is outdated and irrelevant to America, and the result of ineffective leadership. And then came 9/11, which further complicated the situation and the process of integration. It reinforced the divide and created a vicious cycle in which we are caught nowadays. There is anxiety on both sides. The community sees the need and the urgency to integrate, but they are not sure that's possible anymore. Because it is true, as the article suggests, that 9/11 forced Muslim Americans out of their cocoons, but it was too late and probably too little, the efforts of outreach that were done, considering the image problem and the damage caused by the attacks of 9/11. And we have a society that is probably less receptive and less welcoming to this integration. So where do we go from here? In my opinion, it is clear that we are going nowhere with the current situation and the current approaches and strategies. It's not helping the community to be in denial. It's not helping the community to remain in this victimized mindset or to adopt this civil rights strategy, that complaining every day with all these alerts and etc., that's not leading us anywhere. Or focusing on Islamophobia, which personally don't care whether it exists or not, and if it exists, Muslims bear the large part of the responsibility, if it does, because they did not do their homework. On the other hand, treating the community as simply as a security threat, I don't think it's helping. It is the law enforcement did an effective job in preventing any attack with some grain of luck in some cases, but I don't think that is helping solving the problems. We're dealing only with the symptoms of a very complex problem. What is needed, in my opinion, is a comprehensive, integrated strategy based on an objective and thorough diagnosis and strong cooperation among all stakeholders. There are people in the community who have full grasp of the crisis and its root causes. And there are people who know what needs to be done. It is a humongous job. Efforts need to be done to basically convert a community that was built on the premise to be protected from society until people go home into a community that is fully integrated and impactful and have a positive impact in this and significant and sustained contribution to the common good. Nothing short of a process of remaking or rebuilding this community is needed based on a fresh Islamic construct and on the commitment to this country as a homeland and commitment to Islam as a life mission that is centered on uplifting people, serving the common good. And what we're trying to do is building a solid religious grounds and inspiration for civic engagement, genuine citizenship, compassion, and patriotism. And that's, believe me, it's much easier than it might be perceived. We're turning religious motivation and incentive from a headwind to integration into tailwind. And we are tagging or meshing the civic and religious motivations and duties so that the more religious person should be more civically engaged and more compassionate, not the opposite. Because the dichotomy is very artificial and it doesn't have a very solid ground in religion. We realize that the bulk of responsibility is on the community, on us, but again, the stakeholders could and should facilitate the integration of Muslim Americans, not through pressure, but through active, substantive, and biased engagement that will lead the community in the right track and facilitate the integration and strengthen the argument of those who are pushing in this direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Suhail. I want to give Peter a chance to respond, obviously, to the panel's remarks and points being made, and then hopefully not only continue the discussion up here, but also then turn to you for the questions you might have. Peter?
Thank you, Gary, and thanks to the panelists for all their comments. And I will focus on some of the criticisms in the interest of time and try to be very, very, very brief. I've been thinking about Andy McCarthy's point about ideology and versus practice, and it seems to me I've been accused of doing too much here, in a way. It seems to me that the dominant thrust in most writings up to now about what's going on with Muslims in the United States certainly has been totally focused on ideology and ideas and totally devoid of any sense of what actually happens on the ground in people's lives on a day-to-day basis. I don't see myself, I don't think I did in this article, rejecting ideological factors. I'm really trying to right the balance and integrate those into a more on-the-ground social understanding of what's going on, social and political understanding of what's going on with Muslims in America. So I see myself doing both. With regard to Hillel, I don't think I'm as fatalistic as he is about nasty people and Islamophobia. I'm not terribly focused on Islamophobia. I don't think I use that term in my article. My point is simply that if we don't address these questions more intelligently and just simply pander to our own emotions or to those of the mass of ordinary Americans, we don't get anywhere. We wind up producing counterproductive results. Those specifically are those kinds of tendencies reinforce the tendencies that I pointed to among organizations like CARE to get into this dysfunctional mode, and none of us focus on the kinds of questions that I think we need to look at. Certainly the kinds of questions we need to look at, for example, CARE's origins, that our media elites refuse to take seriously and that large numbers of Americans may not understand very well, but they have this gut sense that they're not being played with straight. And I think that is unfortunate and fuels this kind of dysfunctional debate. That doesn't advance things for anybody very well. As for Justin Weiss, he's not convinced or not sure where the salience of the problem is that I'm talking about. Well, the salience of the problem will be the next time, God forbid, unfortunately, we have a terrorist event again in the United States, then all these questions will be salient. That's what my focus is. You're right, I'm not focused on terrorists. I'm focused on ordinary Muslims in their relationships to American society, and how those might be impacted by such events. You raise a very good point about when should we stop apologizing? When do we stop a process of the sort that I suggest we begin? But I think the fact is, we have yet to begin it. When an organization like CARE is routinely and repeatedly described simply as a Muslim civil rights organization, it's not only laughable, it's offensive. With its particular history, and with the kinds of distrust that is out in American society toward Muslims and toward Muslim organizations, to deny what is obvious repeatedly is again counterproductive. Let's get it on the table. We need some sort of lustration process here, where we get these things on the table, look at their implications, and then move beyond them to more important questions, or equally important questions, but get beyond them. We haven't even gotten to that point. So when do we stop apologizing? I would say, when do we start looking at the serious evidence here? The more general point I would make, Justin, is that it seems to me in America today we have any number of issues where these huge gaps between our elites and non-elites in American society. I'm not talking about inequality now, I'm talking about opinion and perception. And it seems to me, whether we're talking about immigration or security issues or Muslims, there are these huge gaps. And that if we don't begin this process of trying to face these issues more straightforwardly, we just have a festering kind of situation where we wind up, again, in these rather dysfunctional discussions that don't really help address the problems at hand and don't really benefit Muslims or non-Muslims. And at that, I think I'll stop. Suhail, you and I can discuss these matters later.
I don't want to forestall conversation up here, so if anybody wants to, hello, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess a couple of points. First, the question that Justin raises is, how much is this is ancient history? And frankly, I don't know. I'm an Islamic historian, and my introduction to the American Muslim community came in the mid-'70s through my teacher, Fazlur Rahman, who was a Pakistani theologian, and he introduced me to a segment of that community, which was the Pakistani community. And perforce I'd become, aware of other aspects of its development. In those days, and this is about 1977, 76, there were, practically speaking, no Muslims in this country. I mean, except for students and a handful of other people. So obviously there's a lot of change since. I think the place when we would have to look at what might be the dynamic, where is it going and so forth, would be where you always look, with the young. And there, I suppose, the demographic, as we say, to look at, and Peter may have looked at this very closely, is the Muslim Student Association, which is on our campuses the most general organization. Now, I do know from on an ad hoc basis that most Muslim students do join the association. The association is, in its origins, brotherhood. A lot of students don't like the Muslim Student Association because it doesn't represent them, but they don't have any other place to go, and no one is so far, except for there's an effort to provide some alternative home for Muslim American students on campus. But that's where you would see what's really alive, because frankly, speaking only for myself, I'm about to be 65, and I am not the future. The future is what young people are. The other thing I wanted to say about what Peter got into about, what's our responsibility as non-Muslims? And he, first of all, suggested that government can't do everything. In fact, at the moment, it's doing the opposite of what it should do, and somehow it's the private sector that needs to handle it, academics, intellectuals, and so forth. And frankly, I wouldn't put much confidence in that source either, for a reason that you mentioned in passing, which is that portion of society doesn't really isn't very clear itself anymore on citizenship and so forth, and is not a spokesman for the position you would like American Muslims to adopt. And I was thinking about this, just in terms of the experience of other groups, including my own. And I don't know, the other practical question is, well, how much time does one have? Well, some problems we've had in this country took quite a long time to sort themselves out. And sometimes they sorted themselves out rather through dramatic events like 9/11. I lived for some years in Milwaukee, which by the time I got there, the newspapers were all published in English. But around 1917, the dominant papers were all in German, which all went bankrupt overnight when we went to war with Germany. And that was, I think, probably a huge shock to the German-American community to find themselves fighting, having to choose between America and Germany. And that problem, I would add, didn't get itself altogether worked out until World War II. So the question is whether we don't, as a nation of immigrants, we won't always have such problems, and there has to be a certain reasonable expectation about what the time frame is for solving them. But the solution, it does seem to me to be, it has something to do with to go back to your point, that America has to be making the argument for itself. And that's why I said at the beginning, I think it's very good that this program is taking place under the auspices of Gary's citizenship project. And I'll finish on this point. I don't know all the details of what that promotes, but I think of my own experience. I grew up in a part of New York where almost everyone was either Italian Catholic or Jewish, and we all went to public school. And the first day, our first Thanksgiving, we were all taught that our founding fathers, our forefathers, had established this country. Now, no one in my class had a grandfather or grandmother who was born in this country. Most of them still didn't speak good English, and several of them didn't speak any English. And one could regard this as a useful fiction, but it was a fiction we all embraced. And we embraced it because, I think, not because we were fools, but because there was a set of principles which we were told actually belonged to us as much as they did to the people we hated who lived on the Upper East Side and who were the WASPs. So, if one's really going to do serious work on this score, it's really going to have to be, it requires something of the kinds of efforts that Gary and this type of program are making, in order to sort of say, well, this is what it means to be an American. This is what it takes to be in America, and along the way, we're going to have to face the fact that people are going to feel divided loyalties because of the way the world is.
Just a very, I promise it will be very quick, but I'd be interested, even in terms of knowledge, to find out what exactly is the relationship between the Muslims organizations and their murky origins, etc., on the one hand, and terrorism on the other hand, because you mentioned the next time people die, etc., but the next time people die, it will be a new Major Hassan. It will be one of these guys who were caught last week or 2 weeks ago, and who, to the best of my knowledge, don't have anything to do with these associations. And so that's why I was starting with the idea of a disconnect between what really matters in terms of hard security, and on the other hand, the whole issue of Americanism of American Muslim, which is a true and important issue, but doesn't rise to the level of a security threat. So basically the question is, what is the relationship between the two, the associations and the security problem?
Quickly, by and large, I don't argue and I don't see any connection between these organizations and terrorism, although there have been some isolated incidents with CARE. You're absolutely right, but as representatives of the Muslim American community, as defining the Muslim American community in political terms, these are the players we'll have to deal with when and if something happens. These are the organizations that can and do play a leadership role in addressing the kinds of questions that I'm suggesting we need to face up to now and not after the next event.
Can I just add to that? There's an extensive history of connections between people who have been affiliated in some manner or other with these organizations and incidents of terrorism. And they perform, are you going to find ISNA indicted for terrorism? No, although they have been in an unindicted co-conspirator in a Hamas financing case. But they perform the same role that the Muslim Brotherhood has traditionally performed in Egypt. They are a way station to step on to whether it's Egyptian Islamic Jihad or Al-Qaeda or another kind of organization. Now, I don't want to overgeneralize and say that anybody who joins a Muslim Students Association is likely to go to that path, but to deny that there is such a process, I think, is to blink reality.
I'd like to turn to you now for any questions you might have. Please wait for a microphone and also just let us know who you are and heaven forbid actually ask a question. Please go ahead.
Mark Krikorian from the Center for Immigration Studies. Peter, you probably know the question I'm going to ask, but given the reduced capacity we have to, as Hillel referred to, sort of get newcomers to buy into us because our elites are essentially post-American, isn't one of the actual concrete steps that's necessary to essentially sort of politically and emotionally assimilate Muslims, which is sort of what you're talking about, reducing immigration? Ongoing admissions of people mean that those people, we have to start all over again. And that can work maybe when you have a strong and self-confident elite that runs the public schools and runs foundations and runs, TV networks and everything else. That elite no longer exists. And so it would seem to me, when the tub is overflowing, you got to turn the tap off first. I got a whole bunch of other questions, but let me just stop with that one.
Well, if the premise of your question, Mark, is that if we turn the tap off now, we'll get strong and self-confident elites later, I'm not sure I accept that. But, okay. Look, I think if your suggestion would lead to reduced numbers of Muslims coming to the United States right now, I think that would be probably an unfortunate outcome in terms of public diplomacy, in terms of our impact on the Muslim world, in terms of what happens to Muslims when they're here and exposed to the United States. So, you raise a big question. I think that's my short answer.
My name is Brent O'Connell.
Would you wait for a mic, please? Thank you.
I'm with the Florida Bar, but Hillel's experience is similar to mine, being raised in New York City. But the thing I find throughout the country, and I've heard this before, our schools do the job at integrating our children. Whether you're Korean in San Francisco, Muslim in Detroit, or a Jew in the Bronx, you're an American, no matter where your people came from. And this started with kindergarten with us. And isn't the school system the answer to this integration?
I think I'll.
Go
ahead. One of the things we were doing under the citizenship program is we've been taking a fairly extensive look at civic education, the state of civic education in the United States. And sort of the short answer is what used to be the primary purpose of the public schools, which was assimilation. Now, whether that actually ever was its chief purpose is a different question, but nevertheless, as a priority, that's what it was, at least in theory. It no longer has anywhere near that status from public school officials, administrators, or the education system. So one of the things we've actually tried to document and talk about and trying to resurrect is actually putting civic education back on a higher priority among educators. Ironically, one of the, all the push for school reform has all been about math and language skills and the like. And because of that push and because of the testing regimes required to sort of sustain, supposedly, the progress being made there, things like civics are actually being pushed aside. Teachers complain repeatedly that there's no time left for them to carry out this function. In fact, the irony is teachers, I have a lot of family who are teachers, and they all hate teaching to tests. When we conducted a survey about a year and a half ago of folks who are involved in civic education in the high schools, a national survey, the overwhelming number of these teachers demanded to be allowed to begin to be part of the testing regime because they thought that was the only way in which their administrators, their bosses, would take seriously their subject matter. So it's not a pretty picture.
One thing I would add to that is that, and this is a point, I think Justin referred to it about care that I make in the article. The problems that we're talking about here, for better or worse, are, I think, much bigger than assimilation or integration. I'll use those terms interchangeably. I refuse to believe there's a difference. The example of CARE, which I think is the most problematic and troublesome Muslim American organization, and it's partly the most troublesome, partly because of its origins, but partly because it is the most dynamic Muslim American organization that manages to bring in substantial numbers of second-generation Muslim Americans who I assure you are very integrated and very assimilated, maybe not thanks to their public schools, but by virtue of our popular culture, our law schools, all sorts of other elements in American society. They feel very entitled as American citizens, very angry as American citizens about the kinds of perceptions that other Americans have of Muslims, of being treated unfairly. And this comes back to my point with Hillel. I'm not particularly preoccupied with Islamophobia per se. I agree that there's a certain amount of conflict and hate in any given society that you can't do much about. But there's something we can do about this, I think, and it's certainly we can observe that the impact of the kinds of things that get said and written about Muslims and have gotten said and written about Muslims since 9/11 fuel the anger of large numbers of Muslim American second-generation youth, often the best educated. I'm not concerned, especially that that they're going to become terrorists. That's not my point, although some minuscule element will, unfortunately. But large numbers of them feel quite outraged at the way they're being treated, and that is, they become not only fodder, but the leaders of the next generation of an organization like CARE, which is not barking up the right tree. It's part of the diversion of focusing on all these other questions instead of focusing on the more pressing questions about how Muslims are going to become loyal American citizens in a way that we can all, that will help us face the threats that we all inevitably face.
Last question.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss. I'm actually a 9/11 survivor from the World Trade Center attacks, and I write a lot about these issues. Mr. Scary, I thought your presentation was good, but the corollary question to what's Muslim Americans' role in society, what our relationship is to them, and I would like the panel to address that a little bit. I think, first of all, I disagree with your comments about CARE being past tense. It's present tense. A lot of the Islamophobia that the Muslim Americans feel, or because organizations like CARE are propagating it. There's not a terrorist yet that, or anyone who's been arrested, that they don't claim it's just because they're Muslim and for no other reason. So I don't think their ideology is past tense. And also, in your article, you said something about the Obama administration has accommodated Muslims a little bit more in a way that's not desirable, but there's only so much they can do. But they've bent over backwards. This administration has bent over backwards to comply to the point where there's no such thing as Islamic terrorism anymore, and it's a national security threat. So if the panel can address those issues, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate your effort to pick a fight with me, but I don't think we basically disagree. I didn't say CARE is past tense at all. I just got through answering this gentleman. Yeah, I do think that functionally their roots in Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, one, need to be owned up to, but two, are not part of the dynamism of the organization now. That's what I argue, that's what I believe. I don't know how much time you spend around CARE, but I spend a fair amount of time, and that's my view. The second point about the Obama administration, you know, I'm sorry, I kind of agree with you. So I don't, you know, like I said, it'd be wonderful to arm wrestle, but I guess I can't.
Anybody else? I apologize that we've run over, but that's because the conversation was interesting, and I do appreciate you all joining us, but also I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists and Peter for a wonderful presentation.